It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
And welcome back to another Real Estate Breakfast. Halfway through our weekend, yes, another Sunday has come to town, October the 5th, and I hope that it was a successful day yesterday with property. Or is it back to those wretched portals today to look where the next opportunity lay? Well, that I think is probably the worst part about a Saturday. You know, so much hope on a property, so much thought and imagining of living in that property, only to have psychological stress kick in when you miss out on it. And if you think that that is over the top, just ask the people who did miss out. Challenge them over the reality of their stress, and that could end up in fisticuffs. Yes, very stressful the weekends when it comes to real estate. It's been another busy week too for us here at the Real Estate Breakfast. Of course, breaking down real estate across Australia. We caught up on Monday with Bryce Houston from Harcourts. Found out all about Carrum Downs, where the median house price is $730,000. Then we also caught up with the news from the RBA, no change, and Michelle Bullock defending her decision. Eliza Owen was here, the head of Residential Research Australia at Cotality, talked about real estate. What else? Alex and Victoria from the Gold Coast, they talked about their beloved area and just the attraction factor that never fades. And we also caught up with Adrian Bowe, the Sydney auctioneer, who was busy at it again yesterday calling auctions. So all of that is coming up after this.
Don't navigate the real estate market alone. Let us help guide you in the world of real estate every day. Make better informed decisions with the latest news and insights.
Carrum Downs, tell us a little bit about, who's moving in, how many households are there, what your farm area is, etc., just to give us a little bit of an understanding, including the population.
Yeah, so there's about 20,000 people live in Carrum Downs. There's probably 9,000 properties available. A lot of them were established in the late 70s, early 80s on one side of Carrum Downs, and then the developers got in and did a lot more newer homes and units from about the year 2000 on. So it's a very affordable, popular suburb.
So tell us a little bit about the investors. They're about, 50% of the people that are buying into your area?
Yeah, that's correct. About 12 months ago, we didn't see a lot of investors. We probably had about 10%, and then that dramatically shifted. And yeah, as you said, we now have about 50% investors. Some buy directly through us and some use buyer's agents, which has been a new phenomena in this suburb. We haven't had buyer's agents contacting us as much before.
I liked what you were telling me before we went on air, and that was you were up bright and early this morning doing mail drops. That's, of course, so important for real estate these days. A lot of agents find it beneath them to get out and do those flyer drops. You were saying that you come from a sales background. You're in automatic mode by the sound of things, Bryce.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, the nice thing about doing that is it's two things. It's good for your headspace. You get up, clear your head. The weather in Melbourne's nice and crisp. At the moment, it's around about, say, 10 degrees in the morning. And I get to see the houses that I'm calling later on in the day. I get to see them face to face and then deliver some information.
What do you say to real estate agents that will be listening this morning, having their breakfast, listening to Bryce saying, yeah, get up nice and early, get that oxygen supply swilling around in my lungs, feeling good for the day? What do you say to those that say, oh, no, that sounds too difficult to me?
I think the biggest thing you hear, and you've probably had it on your show before, is that agents saying, oh, we're desperate for listings. Well, there's plenty out there. They are making more in sub areas, but there's plenty out there. So you just need to get up and hustle. And the joy of it is you get to meet people, sometimes putting out their garbage, sometimes going off to work. So it's a good thing. Up and at it early. Good agents are up usually 5 or 6 a.m. and they're starting to think about the day ahead.
You are sisters in your 20s and you wanted to talk about the negativity that people are talking about when they're moving off from Australia to countries like Vietnam. You say, as bad as buying a property is in Australia, there is no place on earth like living here. And you say that your friends and family are here, and while you could both be earning more money in different countries, the lifestyle of living here, especially in Brisbane and the Gold Coast, is second to none. And you say that you're disappointed to hear about people leaving, but maybe things might be even harder when you leave for another country. And the final thing that you said was, take a chill pill. So I don't think you're alone. I think that people probably can relate to that. If you think Shannon and Denise might be not quite hitting the mark because you are leaving as well, let us know. You know the email address. It is myrealestatepodcast@gmail.com. And don't forget, you can leave a voice message as well. You'll find the recording link in the show notes. All right, let's go to Sydney and catch up with Eliza Owen. She is the Head of Residential Research Australia at Cotality. Good morning to you, Eliza. Welcome back to the Real Estate Breakfast. Yes, I guess different strokes for different folks when it comes to young people either staying or leaving.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me. And I love that advice too. Just take a chill pill. Everyone, just chill out a little bit. You know, when it comes to Australia, we do have cost of living pressures. That's been a pretty universal story. But property prices are also high here for a reason. It's things like that rule of law, the stability that we have politically, and the wonderful lifestyle that we have in Australia. That's a reflection of it. I imagine a lot of people who are moving overseas to get better bang for their buck when it comes to cost of living and housing also have maybe a level of privilege where they can kind of work remotely and still earn a relatively high income. That's just my guess. I don't think that means we totally accept, you know, some of the outstretched levels of affordability that we see and quality of homes and things like that. It is really important perspective to have. So I like that email.
And you were saying to me off air that you've just been talking to a friend of yours that has come back into Sydney, finding the difficult situation of where the market is at the moment.
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and it ties into some recent news that we've seen over the past few weeks about the state of the rental market, the fact that vacancy rates are broadly still really tight across Australia. We've even seen a little bit of re-acceleration in the pace of rent growth. So the rate of growth was cooling down there for a bit. It's picking up a bit now. And it essentially means it's a landlord's market. So my colleague, he's an expat. He's come from the US, and he was somewhat appalled at the state of some of the rental properties that he was inspecting. So things like, you know, curtains that had just been torn down, marks on the walls, marks on the carpet. And he was really surprised to see rental properties presented like that. But it's just, unfortunately, the state of the market that I guess not all landlords would bother to worry about that sort of thing because they don't really have to.
The RBA decided to hold the cash rate at 3.6% today. I think it's mainly on the back of the recent inflationary data, which came in a lot hotter than they expected. We saw the headline number rise to 3% the 12 months to August, which is the highest level in 12 months. Cash rate held at 3.6%.
And this is an interesting question that was asked. And that was, could there be a scenario where we have no further rate cuts, and what that scenario could look like? And as referenced by Michelle Bullock, it could be a good news story for Australia.
Yeah, and it could be. I mean, we've got scenarios on the upside, and one scenario on the upside might be that real income's rising, wealth rising, and consumers now start to spend again. Many households, for example, with mortgages, they've actually been saving rather than spending everything. So as their mortgage repayments have come down, they've opted not to reduce their mortgage payments, they've maintained them. So that's suggesting a bit of caution. So one upside scenario is a positive one, that they react to that and they start start consuming again. That's good for business, good for employment. That's not a bad news scenario, and if that means that we don't lower interest rates further, then I wouldn't say that's necessarily a bad news story. The alternative, of course, is that there's a lot of uncertainty around. There's still things going on overseas that might make people nervous. We know that consumer confidence is still a little bit on the low side. It's possible that that doesn't eventuate, the upside doesn't eventuate, and there's some downside that eventuates, and that affects the employment market. That would have different implications potentially for monetary policy.
And here is a question I think that a lot of people can probably relate to this morning.
What is your message to a family who can't get into the property market now for a first home, but with the same income, combined family income, could have gotten into the property market 20 years ago? There's a relationship between, and I know you don't like to look at it or whatever, but there's a relationship between interest rates and property prices. So what's your message to that family who are facing renting for the remainder of their time?
It's a very, very difficult situation, David, and as an individual and as a citizen, I think we're in a very difficult position with the property market, and I don't actually think most reasonable people think that this is a good outcome. Having said that, there's nothing that I can do personally about it. We don't target housing prices. It's true that part of the transmission mechanism for monetary policy is through the housing market, and we're observing a little bit of that at the moment.
Have come down, property prices have gone up.
Well, they typically do, although I have to say that as interest rates were rising as well, property prices were going up.
That was after a pandemic where you threw billions of dollars at the property market.
So what I would say is that, yes, you're quite right. That is part of the transmission mechanism monetary policy. Can we impact housing prices, or should we impact housing prices? No, we have to focus on our mandate, which is inflation. I've said a number of times before, the problem in the housing market is a structural deficit of supply. That is the problem. Governments now get that, and you are seeing some action on that, but it's going to be slow to work its way through. I'm not confident it's going to make any impact in the next 2 years. So the bottom line is that all I can do is make sure I keep inflation low and stable, and I keep employment as strong as possible, because that gives people the best opportunities to get jobs and be able to possibly get into the market.
It's not about offsetting, it is more about giving me relief through a rate cut.
No, we're not in the business of offsetting price levels and giving people relief. We are in the business of targeting inflation and employment. That's the aim.
Morning. Yes, I think that unfortunately there is still that thirst, perhaps a huge appetite for having things, instantaneously. So lots of people, not everyone, but lots of people want everything now, with the cars, the luxury goods, all those kind of things that back in the day you may think about maybe one day saving up for if it fits into the plan. But now I guess with the comparing what you have to others, and we're all guilty of that at some times, just think that sometimes people maybe focus on that more heavily than planning for the future and that kind of thing. And then that sort of creates this cycle of people going back for more. And then what has someone else got? And it's never really enough, is it, if the appetite can get bigger and bigger for those kind of things. So obviously they've made some sacrifices and thought about the future, which is really smart.
Yeah, no, it's a very smart takeaway. And if you go back before the COVID turned up, back to 2018, it took an average first home buyer on the Gold Coast about 4 years to save up for that 20% deposit. Now it's almost doubled. There is the tale of the tape. Now let's drill into some of the other things that are going on in the Gold Coast at the moment, because in certain Gold Coast suburbs like Burleigh Waters, about 43% of private dwellings are owned outright. So it's just sort of looking at how many people are mortgage-free. If you look at Hope Island, the rate is about 42% mortgage-free. Runaway Bay, yes, one of my favourite locations, that's got about 50% homeowners without a mortgage. You would be seeing that firsthand.
Yes, we're seeing a lot of that. I won't bring up the fact that you missed out on that apartment in Runaway Bay again, Craig. I think I've only brought it up about 8 times, so I won't do it again. Oh, does that make it 9? Sorry. So that's a really telling tale for the Gold Coast market, and it underlines the strength of the market that we have right now. If you wind the clock back pre-COVID, we were one of the pressure points for mortgage stress across Australia. I think we were in the top 5 at one stage.
skip forward to post-COVID, where the retirees have sold up and moved here with their cash, or a lot of interstate sellers have sold in Sydney, Melbourne for what was then mega dollars and bought at great value on the Gold Coast mortgage-free. They've moved up. Let's just say we've come across clients who've sold at, say, 10 to 15 mil in Sydney and bought up here quite comfortably at 3 mil, and then bought the boat, bought the car, bought some of that flash and dash that we talk about, put the kids in good private schools, and they are living mortgage-free, and there is no mortgage stress on that family whatsoever. And that underpins the value of our market. It's been a benefit for some areas of the Gold Coast, and it's certainly been a benefit overall. But in other way, it slows the market down because there's not much pressure, which means there's not much price movement. So it's got a flip side.
Yeah, what do you think? That number, huge number on 5% deposit, it's all about servicing it, of course, at the end of the day.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Craig. Absolutely. Well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but if you look at, say, just an even $1 million mortgage at the current interest rate, have a guess at what just the interest component alone would be over a 30-year period for just $1 million mortgage.
Astronomical.
Well, it's $1.1 million. So $1 million mortgage turns into $2.1 million alone. And that's in a low interest rate environment, given the cash rates at 3.6, bringing, the retail rate at sort of something with a 6 in front of it. Yeah, the interest component alone just on $1 million, to quote you, is certainly astronomical. The threshold has risen. It was 900, bringing it up to now 1.5. So what I noticed, certainly as an auctioneer, when the 900 threshold was in place, basically everything worth around 800 automatically became 900, and people capped out at that. And I think the same thing's going to happen to anything worth around 1.4. It's probably going to creep up to 1.5, which could have, a negative effect potentially on what they're trying to achieve.
When I mentioned that negative equity risk, have you got something that you just sort of throw up, which is in the back of your mind, a really bad example of that in the Sydney property market? Somebody bought at the peak of the market, and then the dominoes effect started kicking in with the interest rates, and you knew, hey, we've got to sell this property, otherwise they could end up losing the lot.
I find the main categories that occurs, Craig, is either if someone bought it off the plan and the construction gets delayed, and then the value does depreciate because, number one, they've bought a brand new product off plan where the marketing was very seducing, and then the reality is it's a brand new product. And then secondly, if it's located in a high density area, an example in Sydney would be Zetland, where it's, it's a high density area in terms of apartments. Basically, by the time the property's ready and complete, you're competing against other properties because there's multiple construction occurring. So, yeah, absolutely, it does occur.
Adrian, I've spoken to a lot of auctioneers. Something that's just sort of made me realise perhaps what somebody could do, maybe they're not an arrogant sort of a person, but if they take on that persona of being quite arrogant, quite loud, sort of bolshy, straight to increasing that bid as soon as the competitor throws one in, just rampant fire, that's probably going to help, isn't it? Sort of acting arrogant if you're not.
Absolutely. And that's why the quicker you're bidding, the more confidently you're bidding, the more vocal and, the more energy and ebullience you've got, definitely creates a perception of strength. Call it arrogance, call it dominance. Either way, it definitely works. I've seen it firsthand.
We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.